The Doomed Sky, Operation Neptune's Gambit. The night the world held its breath. The year is 1944. The world is burning, and the fate of civilization hangs on a single desperate gamble. Europe has become a fortress of concrete, steel, and terror. Hitler's Festung Europa, its defenses sharpened by years of brutal occupation. All across the globe, nations hold their breath, knowing the next move will decide the future of humanity itself. For 4 relentless years, the Western Allies have stared across the English Channel, searching for a way to break the enemy's iron grip. But tonight, in the cold, trembling darkness above those waters, an audacious plan finally awakens. Engines rumble, shadows move. Thousands of young Americans prepare to jump into the unknown, carrying the weight of the free world on their shoulders. We all know the iconic scenes of D-Day, the beaches, the chaos, the relentless waves of infantry pushing through fire and steel. But the true spearhead of the invasion, the chaotic and terrifying strike that shattered the German defenses before the first landing craft touched the sand, came from the sky. Tonight, we plunge into the darkness of that airborne assault, into Operation Neptune's most dangerous secret. The American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were thrown into a hurricane of flak, scattered drops, and deadly confusion. The sky became their battlefield, and every man knew the truth. This was a one-way ticket into hell. To understand the genius behind the American airborne plan, you first have to understand the impossible challenge the Allies faced. Eisenhower knew that a frontal assault on the beaches Utah and Omaha would be nothing short of suicidal unless the flanks were secured with absolute precision. That responsibility fell on 2 of America's most feared and respected airborne divisions, the 82nd All-American and the 101st Screaming Eagles. The 101st Airborne's mission was brutally clear: seize the western exits from Utah Beach, especially the narrow causeways cutting across the flooded marshlands. Picture thousands of infantrymen forced to move single file along elevated roads, completely exposed to German guns. If those causeways remained in enemy hands, Utah Beach wouldn't be a landing zone. It would be a massacre. The Screaming Eagles had to silence artillery, demolish bridges over the Douve River, and hold those lifelines open at any cost. But the 82nd Airborne faced an even more terrifying directive. Their objective stretched deep into enemy territory: secure the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and, more critically, the crossings over the Merderet River. That winding river, framed by thick bocage hedgerows, formed the perfect natural defensive line for a German counterattack. If the 82nd failed, the enemy could slice the invasion force in half and drive it back into the Channel. Their drop was designed to confuse, isolate, and block German reinforcements, especially the dreaded Panzer divisions. And here is where the blueprint turned into a nightmare. The plan was immaculate on paper, but everything depended on perfect conditions: clear skies, disciplined formations, precise navigation. Instead, the airborne armada flew straight into a storm of chaos. The weather was vicious. Low clouds and patches of fog swallowed the horizon. German anti-aircraft fire flak erupted from the ground like volcanic fury, tearing into the transport planes. Many pilots, young and terrified, were forced to fly dangerously low and fast to survive. Their formations shattered. Their navigation failed, and the paratroopers were dropped miles from their intended zones into fields, forests, rivers, and, in some cases, directly onto German strongpoints. General Maxwell Taylor of the 101st would later call it the most dispersed and disorganized drop in military history. And yet, here lies the great paradox, the hidden brilliance no planner foresaw. the chaos itself became a weapon. Small, scattered groups of American paratroopers erupted across the countryside like sparks on dry tinder, attacking German positions from every angle, overwhelming their ability to coordinate a defense. What should have been a disaster became the very reason the invasion succeeded. The fog of war, the gift of confusion. Imagine, just for a moment, that you are a German commander on the night of June 5, 1944. You know the Allies are coming. Your intelligence officers have warned you for months that an invasion is imminent, maybe in Calais, maybe in Normandy, maybe somewhere else entirely. But suddenly, your field telephone erupts with frantic reports. Paratroopers spotted near Cherbourg. No-wait enemy troops landing near Carentan. Correction. A massive American force has just dropped into the fields outside your own headquarters. Everything contradicts everything. Nothing makes sense. Because the American drop was so wildly scattered, the paratroopers weren't landing in neat battalions or organized waves. They were falling into Normandy in tiny, fragmented groups, squads, trios, pairs, even lone soldiers drifting silently through the night. Over an area nearly 1,000 square miles wide, the Americans appeared like ghosts. This was the accidental genius of the operation. The Germans simply could not distinguish between a small misdrop and a coordinated, multi-division airborne assault. Every small cluster of paratroopers that managed to regroup, often mixing men from different companies, different regiments, even different divisions, instantly became a new and unpredictable threat. Instead of one or two major airborne thrusts, the Germans suddenly faced dozens. A farmhouse, a hedgerow, a crossroads, any of these could erupt with gunfire. Attacks came from the north, then from the west, then from directions the Germans didn't even think Americans could reach. A platoon of 10 determined paratroopers could tie down an entire German company simply because the Germans believed they were battling a far larger, coordinated force. One of the most haunting examples of this chaos unfolded in the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. The drop over the area was catastrophically off-target. Some paratroopers drifted directly into the brightly lit town square, exposed by a burning house fire below. German troops fired as the men descended helplessly. Private John Steele famously became ensnared on the church steeple, dangling above the battle, forced to play dead as German soldiers moved below him. It was a scene of horror and heartbreak. Yet even here, especially here, the psychological shock to the Germans was enormous. They had expected airborne landings, yes, but not like this. Not scattered, not relentless, not on top of them. The mission of the 82nd Airborne was to secure the crossroads and choke points surrounding Sainte-Mère-Église. By 4:30 a.m., despite the chaos and casualties, elements of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had captured the town. They were led by the indomitable Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin van der Voort, the legendary officer who continued to command despite fighting with a broken leg from a previous jump. Under his direction, Sainte-Mère-Église became the first town liberated in France during the invasion. This single victory shattered the cohesion of the German western flank. Their response slowed to a crawl, paralyzed by fear of phantom airborne divisions that didn't exist. Chaos, when wielded by the right force, becomes control. And the Americans that night mastered chaos like no army before them. Chaos, courage, and the unyielding line. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, dropped into a nightmare sculpted by both nature and German engineering. Their mission was brutally simple: secure the 4 causeways leading inland from Utah Beach. But the terrain had been transformed into a killing field. Expecting the invasion, the Germans had opened the floodgates, turning the already low-lying Norman fields into vast sheets of shallow, icy water. Only the narrow, raised causeways remained above the flood. These single-lane dirt roads were perfectly pre-sited for German artillery, machine guns, and mortars. Anyone who tried to cross them was walking straight into a meat grinder. The 101st drop was catastrophic in every sense. The famed 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, later immortalized as the Band of Brothers, was scattered across the marshlands. Many troopers plunged straight into the flooded darkness, weighed down by over 100 pounds of gear rifles, ammo, grenades, radios, demolition packs. The water swallowed them whole. Some never resurfaced. Men fought just to stay afloat, slashing at their harnesses, gasping for air, sinking as their equipment pulled them down. Radios drowned. Weapons disappeared. In moments, the structure of companies and regiments dissolved into chaos. And yet, in this disaster lay one of the deepest American advantages, not of planning, but of culture. The American Airborne was built on the principle of decentralized command. Every sergeant, every junior officer, every experienced private was trained not just to follow orders, but to create them. When 10 or 12 troopers finally crawled out of the swamp and found each other, often men from entirely different units, the senior man took charge instantly. Lieutenant, sergeant, even a map-savvy private, it didn't matter. There was no waiting for commanders, no hesitation, no paralysis. These small groups became autonomous strike teams. One of the defining examples of this doctrine in action was the fight for the Carentan Canal Bridge. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole dropped miles off course, gathered nearly 400 scattered paratroopers men from multiple companies, many shell-shocked and waterlogged. Cole didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He recognized the truth immediately. The bridges had to be taken now, before the Germans organized. He led his mixed force south through the thick Norman bocage, those towering hedgerows that turned every field into a fortified maze, and smashed into the German positions controlling causeways 1 and 2. The Germans, expecting a structured assault from a fully assembled regiment, were stunned. Instead of one coordinated attack, pockets of American paratroopers kept erupting from different directions. North, south, across fields they believed impassable. Confused, the Germans overestimated the American numbers and repeated their fatal mistake. They defended everywhere, but controlled nothing. The battle for the La Barquette Lock, controlling the Douve River's floodwaters, was even more brutal. The 501st PIR waded shoulder-deep through freezing swamps under machine gun fire. It was a vicious, close-quarters fight against elite German paratroopers, some of Hitler's best infantry. But the Americans attacked from angles the Germans never anticipated. Piece by piece, house by house, hedgerow by hedgerow, the 501st forced them back. When the Americans finally secured the lock, they did more than seize a position. They gained control of the flooding itself, denying the Germans a massive environmental advantage. By the time the assault waves of the 4th Infantry Division stormed Utah Beach, the 101st had carved a bloody but unbroken path through the flooded nightmare. The causeways were open. The flank was secure. The Germans, expecting hours of resistance, now faced an American land force advancing faster than their intelligence could track. The Screaming Eagles had done their job fragmented, leaderless, half-drowned, improvising every minute, but unwavering in their mission. The cost had been staggering. Men had drowned alone in the dark. Others fell in the hedgerows with no idea where their regiment even was. But in the end, the 101st Airborne had proven the truth of their creed. They may have landed alone, but they fought together. The decentralized courage of individual soldiers, privates, sergeants, lieutenants, held the line when organization collapsed. It was not just strategy that won the causeways. It was grit. It was instinct. It was the refusal of American paratroopers to let chaos scatter their will. The Iron Crossings, the 82nd, holds the Murderette. While the 101st fought drowning fields and marshland chaos to the east, the 82nd Airborne, the All-American Division, was waging a different kind of war on the western flank. Their battleground was the winding, deceptively quiet Murderette River. Securing the crossings here was not just important, it was existential. These bridges were the only direct route for the Germans to push heavy armor and infantry eastward for a decisive counterattack. If German panzer divisions managed to break through the Murderette and strike toward the beach, the entire Allied landing force could be cut cleanly in half. If the 82nd failed, D-Day itself might collapse. The drop into this region was just as scattered and chaotic as that of the 101st. Paratroopers from the 507th and 508th PIRs landed in fields, orchards, rivers, even treetops, many miles from their intended drop zones. But small, improvised groups quickly formed and began moving toward their objectives. The fight for the La Fière Bridge, a toward a modest stone crossing and its adjoining narrow causeway, quickly became one of the most iconic battles of the entire Normandy invasion. A small band of American paratroopers seized the western approach, but they were immediately confronted by wave after wave of German infantry, supported by the looming threat of armored vehicles. The Germans understood the importance of La Fière just as clearly as the Americans did. For 3 merciless days, the causeway became a narrow, exposed killing field, 100 yards of open ground with no cover, perfectly aligned with German machine guns, snipers, and mortars. The Americans dug into the eastern bank. The Germans dug into the western. Neither could cross without being cut down. Ammunition dwindled. Casualties mounted. The paratroopers found themselves trapped, surrounded on 3 sides, fighting off repeated German counterattacks with nothing but grit, bayonets, and sheer refusal to yield. To survive, the paratroopers adopted a savage, improvised tactic: aggressive counter-assaults. Instead of waiting for the Germans to build momentum, small groups of American soldiers would suddenly surge forward. 10 men, 12 men hurling grenades, firing short bursts, and then withdrawing before the Germans could react in force. These violent, unpredictable jabs kept the Germans constantly off balance. General James Gavin, already a legend for leading from the front, embodied this doctrine. Jumping into Normandy with nothing more than his rifle and a handful of men, he preached one rule: when in doubt, take the offensive. That mindset became the heartbeat of the 82nd. The final breakthrough at La Fière was not a tactical maneuver. It was a raw, primal act of courage. Major John K. Red Dog Johnson, a man as fierce as his nickname, ordered a bayonet charge straight across the exposed causeway. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only option left. As Johnson's men roared forward, the Germans hesitated for a fatal heartbeat, shocked by the ferocity of an attack no commander should logically attempt. That heartbeat was enough. The American wave slammed into the German positions like a hammer. The line buckled. The western bank fell. For the first time in 3 days, the causeway was open. With the bridge finally secured, exhausted survivors of the 82nd held the ground desperately until infantry forces from Utah Beach linked up with them. The Murderette crossings were safe. The German opportunity for a decisive armored strike evaporated. The western flank of the invasion was no longer vulnerable. It was anchored by blood, steel, and the unbreakable will of men who fought without certainty, without reinforcements, and often without hope. This battle revealed the third secret of the airborne success: unflinching tenacity. German soldiers were disciplined, well-trained, and formidable, But the American paratrooper had something unique, the absolute belief that he must complete his mission, no matter how hopeless the situation appeared. These were men who fought alone, cut off, deprived of sleep and ammunition, soaked in mud, surrounded by enemies, and still refused to yield an inch of ground. By holding the Murderette, the 82nd didn't just secure a bridge, they protected the entire western half of D-Day. Their stand at La Fière ensured that the Allied invasion would live, and that Hitler's fortress would finally begin to crumble. Gadgets, ghosts, and the art of deception. The success of the American Airborne was more than raw courage, more than decentralized leadership. Beneath the chaos and heroism lay something colder, calculated, and brilliantly engineered. Meticulous preparation and specialized gear crafted for men who would be fighting alone behind enemy lines. Every piece of equipment, every ounce of weight, had a purpose. These soldiers were expected to operate independently for days without resupply or support. Their tools had to be versatile, durable, and deceptively simple, because failure meant death. One of the smallest and most iconic of these tools was the cricket. Nothing high-tech, just a tiny spring steel clicker that fit in the palm of a hand. But in the darkness of the Norman bocage, it was priceless, an auditory password that could mean the difference between life and death. The system was simple: 1 click to challenge, 2 clicks to reply. The brilliance of the cricket wasn't in its sound, it was in its psychology. Germans could mimic American accents, even English slang, but they couldn't guess the unique rhythm of a metal clicker in the dark. Imagine stepping through hedgerows at 2 a.m., hearing a twig snap and clicking once. Then 2 clicks back. Relief. A friend. If no response came, the silence itself became a warning. This tiny strip of metal prevented friendly fire, reunited scattered paratroopers, and restored order to a night designed to be chaotic. Equally crucial, but far more cumbersome, was the leg bag, often called the paracrate. Paratroopers jumped with over 100 pounds of gear, but their heavier equipment couldn't be strapped to their bodies during the drop. The leg bag carried the essentials: broken down M1 Garands, ammunition, radios, explosives, entrenching tools, and medical kits. Each bag descended on its own miniature parachute, tethered by a cord to the jumper. In theory, the trooper would land, sprint to the bag, cut it free, and be ready to fight. In practice, Normandy turned this into chaos. Flooded fields swallowed leg bags whole. Strong winds shredded the cords. Bags burst on impact. Yet paratroopers were drilled relentlessly to recover them. Because losing a leg bag meant entering battle half-armed and unthinkable disadvantage when surrounded by German forces. But perhaps the most ambitious piece of technology was the Rebecca-Eureka navigation system. These were early transponders designed to solve a critical airborne problem: how to guide incoming aircraft to the exact drop zones during the night. The Eureka beacon, carried by the paratroopers, transmitted a signal. The Rebecca receiver, installed in the transport planes, homed in on that signal, giving pilots a clear directional arrow even through cloud and darkness. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, the skies over Normandy were a storm of flak and confusion. Many Eureka teams never reached the correct positions. Others were killed on landing, and pilots, dodging anti-aircraft fire, couldn't maintain the straight, steady flight path needed to follow the signal. The system that was supposed to bring order instead became another casualty of the chaotic night. And yet, there is a deeper lesson buried inside these innovations. Technology often fails when the battlefield refuses to cooperate. What ultimately saved the airborne was not the high-tech experiments or the complex interlocking systems. It was the simple tools and the fundamental training embedded in every soldier. the crickets, the map and compass, the instinct for direction, the trust in the man next to you. When the Eureka beacons went silent, when leg bags vanished in the marshes, when radios drowned in the floodwaters, the paratroopers fell back on the most reliable instruments they had, their discipline and improvisation. It was the low-tech solutions, the things that weighed almost nothing, that had the biggest impact. These tools didn't just support the mission, they shaped the psychology of survival. Operation Titanic, the Phantom Drop. The success of the airborne assault wasn't only born from courage, chaos, or tactical brilliance, it also emerged from one of the most audacious deception operations of World War II. While scattered American paratroopers created confusion on the ground, Allied planners sought to magnify that confusion to a breaking point. The result was Operation Titanic, a psychological warfare masterpiece that weaponized fear, noise, and illusion. This was deception elevated to a military art form, the deliberate planting of ghosts across the French countryside to fracture the German response before it could even form. At the heart of Operation Titanic were the famous Rupert and Oscar dummies mannequins dressed in crude paratrooper uniforms. On the ground, they looked almost laughable. But falling from the sky at 2 a.m., with faint silhouettes lit by fires and tracer rounds, they appeared terrifyingly real. Each dummy was fitted with a small explosive charge that detonated upon landing, mimicking the sound of troopers firing weapons or destroying equipment. The purpose was simple, yet brilliant. Convince German commanders that massive airborne forces were descending across France everywhere, except where the real Americans were landing. These phantom troops were scattered far from the actual landing zones, in places like the Brittany Peninsula to the west and along the Seine River to the east. Entire German garrisons jolted awake to the sight of parachutes descending by the dozens. Machine guns opened up. Floodlights scanned the skies. Troops rushed out of barracks expecting a full-scale assault. And when the dummies hit the ground and their charges exploded, the illusion was complete. Reports flooded German headquarters. Enemy airborne troops landing in strength request reinforcements immediately. Commanders couldn't ignore these reports because the stakes were too high. One wrong assumption could doom the entire defense of Normandy. One of the most famous incidents unfolded near the town of Yvetot, where a German battalion spent hours engaged in a firefight with a field full of Ruperts. The battalion's commander, completely convinced he was under attack by a regiment-sized American force, poured ammunition into the night. His frantic reports up the chain of command described a major American airborne incursion east of the invasion zone. In reality, he was fighting straw, cloth, and air. It didn't matter. Those false reports slowed down the redeployment of German reserve units for hours, precious hours, that the Allies needed. But Operation Titanic didn't rely on mannequins alone. Hidden among the falling dummies were small teams of real SAS commandos experts in sabotage, misdirection, and noise warfare. Their mission wasn't to win battles. Their mission was to sound like they were winning battles. They set off bundles of firecrackers to simulate machine gun bursts. They used portable loudspeakers to broadcast recordings of shouting soldiers, battlefield chaos, and even cheers to trick Germans into thinking airborne units were massing. They detonated explosives at irregular intervals, mimicking mortar strikes or demolition charges. A handful of men created the illusion of hundreds. This masterstroke represents the fourth secret of airborne success: the art of misdirection. Warfare isn't just about bullets and bodies, it's about perception. If you can make your enemy believe something, then in a very real sense, it becomes true. By creating phantom divisions across France, the Allies forced the Germans to split their attention, dilute their strength, and send their critical panzer reserves toward threats that didn't exist. Instead of one overwhelming counterattack, German forces embarked on a series of hesitant, fragmented movements, unable to determine where the real fight was happening. Operation Titanic turned the airborne invasion into a massive, real-time shell game. The Germans kept lifting cups and finding nothing underneath. Meanwhile, under the cover of this illusion, the real American paratroopers secured bridges, causeways, crossroads, and villages. They bled and died not just for ground, but for time, the single most valuable resource of the entire D-Day operation. Because every minute that German reserves chased ghosts was another minute that Allied forces built up strength on the beaches, pushing the invasion forward inch by inch. In the end, the Airborne Divisions, real and fake, were two halves of the same weapon. The Ruperts sowed terror and confusion. The SAS amplified the illusion. And the real paratroopers exploited the chaos. The Germans were deceived not because they were foolish, but because the deception was flawlessly designed. The Americans didn't just drop soldiers, they dropped uncertainty, fear, and doubt across the entire French countryside. And that fog of doubt helped ensure that when the Allies hit the beaches of Normandy, the German war machine was looking the wrong way, the handshake and the hedgerow hell. By mid-morning on June 6th, the sun finally began clawing its way through the low gray mist that had smothered Normandy since the night before. On Utah Beach, the men of the 4th Infantry Division were pushing inland, led by Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., limping ashore with a cane in one hand and a pistol in the other. He was the oldest man in the first wave, the son of a president, and the only general to land in the very first assault. And yet, instead of the massacre they had braced for, they found something shocking. Silence, broken only by scattered gunfire and distant explosions. The Atlantic Wall here had not collapsed by accident. The reason for this eerie quiet lay just beyond the dunes. While the 4th Division expected to fight tooth and nail to secure the beach exits, they discovered that the path inland, those narrow causeways crossing the flooded marshes, was already in American hands. The 101st Airborne Division, soaked, battered, and scattered by the night drop, had somehow accomplished the impossible. They had secured the exits before the first landing craft touched the sand. The link-up between the airborne and the seaborne troops is one of the most overlooked yet decisive moments of D-Day. There were no triumphant cheers, no staged photographs, just a ragged, exhausted convergence of two halves of the same army. The infantrymen, who had spent the morning wading through surf, still looked relatively clean, their uniforms crisp. The paratroopers, by contrast, looked like men who had clawed their way out of the earth itself, faces streaked with swamp mud, uniforms torn, eyes hollow from 12 hours of close combat, drowning, and darkness. Near Exit 2, a patrol from the 4th Infantry approached a cluster of figures crouched around a hedgerow. Weapons raised, nerves high, they prepared for a firefight, until a lone paratrooper stood, lifted a tired arm, and shouted. The tension broke instantly. Moments later, the division commanders met. General Maxwell Taylor of the 101st, still streaked with mud from the night's chaos, greeted the officers of the 4th with a dry, unforgettable line. "We're sure glad to see you. It was getting a little lonely out here." It was a moment of triumph, not with trumpets or flags, but with the quiet acknowledgement that the plan had worked, and that the airborne had paid dearly to make it so. That handshake represented more than a meeting of units. It signified the success of the entire Utah Beach landing. The 4th Infantry Division suffered fewer than 200 casualties, a miracle, especially when compared to the horrors unfolding simultaneously on Omaha Beach. This relative safety was purchased by the blood of the paratroopers who had neutralized artillery batteries, secured causeways, blown bridges, and held open the exits while cut off and surrounded. But relief was a luxury that lasted only minutes. As the link-up solidified, a new, grim reality set in. The beachhead, though secure, was dangerously shallow. To the south lay Carentan, the critical junction connecting Utah and Omaha. Without Carentan, the Germans could drive a wedge between the two American forces and crush them separately. The paratroopers of the 101st, already running on fumes, soaked to the bone, and bleeding from a night of impossible battles, now received new orders. Prepare to move. Prepare to attack. Their war, far from ending, was only evolving. The hedgerows of Normandy awaited dense, claustrophobic, and deadly. The crucible of Carentan, linking the beaches. Carentan was not just another Norman village. It was the keystone of the entire American front. Surrounded by swamps and cut off by flooded fields, the town sat like a fortress suspended on islands of dry land. The only approach was a narrow, deadly causeway stretching over marshes and drainage ditches. Whoever controlled Carentan controlled the link between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. Without it, the American invasion would remain split in two, dangerously vulnerable to a German wedge attack. For the 101st Airborne, battered from the night drop, Carentan would become their defining trial. The job fell to the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by the relentless Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, the same officer who had fought through the swamps of Utah Beach on D-Day. The causeway into Carentan would soon earn the grim nickname Purple Heart Lane. German artillery, mortars, and machine guns swept every inch of the embankment. Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, adding terror to chaos. The paratroopers couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, couldn't even lift their heads. They were pinned in roadside ditches, water rising to their chests, dead and wounded lying beside the living. It was a nightmare with no tactical solution, until Cole chose one through sheer force of will. In an era of tanks, artillery, and automatic weapons, he ordered something nearly unthinkable: a bayonet charge, a tactic from another century, resurrected out of desperation. Cole raised a whistle to his lips, blew the signal, and surged out of the ditch with his men close behind him. They sprinted straight into the German line, into the muzzle flashes of machine guns. The fighting at the farmhouse strongpoint was savage and intimate. Grenades thrown at point-blank range, rifles used as clubs, bayonets driven home in the mud and smoke. Against all odds, they took it. Cole's charge cracked open the German defenses and pushed the enemy into retreat. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions, though heartbreakingly, he would never live to see it, killed in Holland months later. But Carentan was still not secure. The Germans counterattacked fiercely, throwing the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Elite mechanized infantry directly at the exhausted paratroopers. What followed was the infamous Battle of Bloody Gulch. The 101st, armed mostly with rifles, bazookas, and raw defiance, faced armored vehicles and heavy weapons. Their lines buckled under the pressure. They were minutes from being overrun. Then came salvation. The ground began to shake. Through the hedgerows emerged the unmistakable silhouettes of Sherman tanks, the armored fists of the 2nd Armored Division, known as Hell on Wheels. Their arrival turned the tide instantly. Shells roared downrange, shredding German infantry and scattering the SS assault. The paratroopers, who had held the line with almost nothing left to give, watched as American armor smashed the counterattack and secured the battlefield. With the fall of Carentan and the repulse of the German counteroffensive, the impossible became reality. Utah and Omaha were finally linked. The American beachhead was no longer a pair of isolated footholds. It was a continuous, expanding front. The paratroopers had endured swamps, causeways, bayonet charges, and tanks, and they emerged victorious. Carrington became the crucible in which the legend of the 101st Airborne was forged. Exhausted, battered, bleeding but unbroken, they had delivered the link that made the liberation of France possible. The Green Hell War in the Bocage. With Utah and Omaha linked, the Allies pushed inland. What followed wasn't a parade of victory, but a grinding, horrific slog through the heart of Normandy, the Bocage. To anyone who fought there, the beaches were a distant memory. The Bocage was worse. Much worse. These ancient, sunken lanes wound through the countryside, bordered by earthen embankments topped with thick, impenetrable hedges. Some of these hedgerows were 10 feet high, dense with tangled undergrowth, and nearly impossible to navigate. Each field became a natural fortress, where a single German machine gun team or anti-tank gun could hold up an entire battalion for days. For the paratroopers, who had been trained for mobile warfare for fluid, fast-moving assaults, the Bocage was a claustrophobic nightmare. The hedges cut off their line of sight, often to less than 50 yards. The battlefield became a deadly maze. Flanking was impossible. There was no room for the daring, lightning-fast maneuvers that had worked so well on the beaches. Instead, every field had to be taken by storm. Every inch of ground was hard-won at the cost of heavy casualties. It wasn't about speed or chaos anymore. It was about sheer, unrelenting adaptation. To survive in the Bocage, the paratroopers had to evolve. The once rapid pace of the airborne assault slowed to a crawl as they adapted to this new, unforgiving environment. They worked in combined arms teams, collaborating closely with tanks. But even tanks had to be modified for this battle. The famous Rhino tank cutter's steel teeth, welded onto the front of Sherman tanks, were invented to tear through the dense hedges. These steel jaws allowed tanks to slice through the thick shrubbery rather than attempt to climb over it, where their vulnerable underbellies would be exposed to deadly anti-tank fire. Despite the new tactics, the Bocage was still a grinder. It became a battlefield of small, deadly engagements, short-range patrols, grenade duels, and mortar ambushes. Every battle was a close-quarters firefight, each field fought for inch by bloody inch. Yet, the 82nd and 101st Airborne adapted to this hellish environment. They proved that elite troops weren't just elite because they could jump out of planes. They were elite because they could adapt and thrive, no matter how brutal or confining the battlefield became. The paratroopers didn't just fight the Germans in the Bocage. They fought the very landscape itself, slowly bleeding the German army dry, field by field. The fight in the Bocage would last for weeks, a long, drawn-out struggle that wore both sides down. The paratroopers' courage and adaptability turned the Bocage from a natural fortress into a killing ground for the Germans. Slowly, inch by bloody inch, the Americans pushed forward, never letting up. The Bocage was hell. But the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st showed that they could conquer it, just as they had conquered everything that had come before. They weren't just fighting to take ground, they were fighting to prove that nothing, no terrain, no enemy, could stop them. The butcher's bill, was it worth it? Success in war is never free. It is purchased in a currency of blood, grief, and lost futures. When we reflect on the achievements of the American airborne forces in Normandy, their courage, their tactics, their improvisation, we must not lose sight of the staggering cost behind those successes. The battle was won not just by the triumph of tactics, but by the sacrifice of those who fought and died to create the conditions for victory. The scattered drops of the airborne forces, though a nightmare of confusion for the Germans, meant that many paratroopers fought alone, isolated in enemy territory. They faced the darkness of the bocage, the terror of being surrounded, and the overwhelming weight of uncertainty. For many, death came silently in those fields, with their bodies left untouched for weeks or even months. The fight for the causeways and bridges cost entire companies, leaving only fragments of the brave men who once made up the 82nd and 101st Airborne. By the time the 82nd and 101st were pulled from the line in July 1944 to return to England for refitting, they were shells of their former selves. The 82nd Airborne Division alone suffered over 1,200 casualties on D-Day. By the end of the Normandy campaign, just 33 days later, they had lost more than 5,000 men killed, wounded, or missing nearly half of their original strength. The 101st was similarly decimated, with over 4,600 casualties throughout the campaign. Walk through the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer today. Look at the crosses, row upon row. You will see them by the hundreds. Private, 506th PIR. Captain, 505th PIR. Sergeant, 508th PIR. These men were the tip of the spear. They were the ones who jumped into the dark when the world was watching, with no reinforcements, no heavy armor, no artillery support. They had only their rifles, their training, and each other. Their sacrifice did more than just secure a beachhead. It broke the psychological back of the German defense in the West. It proved that Fortress Europe could be breached from the inside out. The Germans, who had long believed their coastal defenses were impregnable, now saw that their own fortress could be shattered by elite troops, fighting on their own without the luxury of overwhelming firepower. These men made it possible for the Allies to push forward, to take Normandy, and to turn the tide of the war. The four pillars of victory. So, what were the true secrets of the American airborne operation in Normandy? If we strip away the myth and look at the tactical reality, four pillars emerge. Four principles that guided the paratroopers through the chaos and forged their legacy. First, the weaponization of chaos. The disastrous scattering of the airborne drops, which many saw as a failure, actually became the ultimate force multiplier. The confusion of isolated, scattered units paralyzed the German command structure, disrupting their ability to mount a coordinated counterattack. The Germans could not distinguish between a few lost men and a full-scale airborne assault. Every small, chaotic force became an unpredictable threat, preventing the Germans from reacting with precision. Second, decentralized leadership. The American soldier was trained to think, to lead when necessary. When the generals were absent and the colonels were dead, the sergeants and privates took charge. They understood the intent of the mission, not just the orders. This decentralized leadership allowed them to act quickly, decisively, without waiting for commands that might never come. In the darkest moments, it was the junior officers and NCOs who held the line and kept the mission alive. Third, innovation and deception. The Allies turned to every trick in the book to confuse and disorient the Germans, often relying on simple yet ingenious tools. From the subtle cricket clickers that ensured friendly fire was avoided, to the elaborate Rupert dummies in Operation Titanic, the airborne soldiers used deception to great effect. Their tactics were not just about brute force. They were about making the enemy question everything they saw, heard, and feared. Fourth, unyielding tenacity. The paratroopers' refusal to accept defeat is what set them apart. Whether it was holding the Lafayette Bridge against German tanks, or charging the causeways at Carentan with nothing but bayonets, they simply refused to be beaten. They understood that their task was not just to secure ground, but to hold the door open for the rest of the world to walk through. They gave everything, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. General Eisenhower later said that the airborne troops displayed courage and devotion to duty, unexcelled in history. But perhaps the best summary comes from a German Corps commander, who, when interrogated after the war, simply shook his head and said, "We could not understand how they were everywhere at once." They were everywhere. They were the sky soldiers. And on that dark, rainy night in June 1944, they didn't just fight. They saved the world. Join the ranks. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the secrets of D-Day, you know what to do. The history of warfare is filled with stories of impossible odds and incredible courage, and we are going to tell them all right here. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next operation. We've got a massive documentary coming up on the German perspective of D-Day, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. And now, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you think the D-Day invasion would have succeeded without the airborne operation? Or do you think the Germans would have pushed the beach landings back into the sea? Let's debate it in the comments. This has been Patriot's Story. Dismissed.